Oh
Yeah,
gosh.
this
No, no,
meeting's.
no. Wait a
Oh,
second.
yeah, it says live stream now.
Oh.
For the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rulemaking for the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee, which we are attending meeting 6 of this group this morning. We have some good discussions to talk about to wrap up our conversations around the definition of needed housing. The third element of location, you all have already touched on some of that. We're bringing that forward and then expanding on that, and we'll get to that as we go. And let's see, locational attributes I mentioned. As with other meetings, we're going to just dive right in. Mari and Celestina are here to help frame the discussions and keep us rolling during the discussion time. And then Andre Tremblay and Alan Lazo are here to frame up some of the affirmatively furthering fair housing issues as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Mari for racial equity framework.
Thank you, Deb. Good morning, everyone. So good to see you all. As Deb said, I'll be grounding us in our racial equity framework per usual. Today, if you look to our agenda, we are spotlighting the same two categories that have been spotlighted from the racial equity framework in the last two meetings. So we have noted data equity and data justice and community engagement and empowerment. And again, the call to action is to lean into the entirety of the framework, but also kind of maybe a stronger emphasis on the spotlighted categories. And the reason being those seem to have all the categories, and I just want to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. All the categories on the racial equity framework definitely have a direct nexus to the discussion today, but the ones specifically seem to align in our minds, the LCD staff's minds, a little bit more closely to today's discussion. And so that's why those are spotlighted. So definitely lean into those categories as we dig into the discussion segment of our agenda. And like last week, Deb will be making space at the end of the meeting to kind of circle back to the racial equity framework and specifically those categories, and might invite one or two of you to, offer your feedback on how well we did to make that connection during the discussion, or maybe where we were off, or just anything that comes to mind related to the racial equity framework that you want to offer. We did that last week, and we heard loud and clear. Maybe the discussion questions didn't lend themselves well to the spotlighted categories. We hopefully address that this time around. But the opportunity to lean on you all's expertise helps us also do better, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here in this work generally, but also the work itself. So with that, data equity and data justice, think about, are the data and the research being used for the analysis framed with an equity and data justice focus, and community engagement, empowerment, also data, but qualitative data, and what are the methods of engaging communities in the development of the work here. It won't take much time, but with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Deb.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to acknowledge a couple, well, at least one other staff person that's in the room today is Mitch Hanush with OHCS. We're glad you're here, Mitch. And with that, I thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Andre Tremblay.
Good morning. Mari, can you queue up the PowerPoint? So, good morning, everyone. We're going to be continuing our discussion on the intersection of fair housing and needed housing today. Next slide. So again, a little grounding in where we've come from, what we're doing, and where we're headed. Today, we're going to focus on the aspect of needed housing that has to do with location and how it interacts with fair housing. And so that's the primary focus of today's meeting. And today's meeting and many of the meetings preceding up to and including today are all sort of building important context and background information leading up to the meetings that are going to be happening in May, which is when more, I'll say, choices or recommendations will be coming forward about the kinds of things to be incorporated in the rules and in the advice or recommendations. So meeting 7 is going to be dealing with fair housing issues and integrating analytical processes for affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so it'll touch on the kinds of topics you see right there and really kind of ask you to chime in on those issues. Are the areas relevant and workable? What kinds of data would be useful to the analysis? How might cities make choices among all the potential issues to address, and then also the actions that they have to address those issues? What criteria, what ideas should they use? Next slide. So again, just to pick up a few ideas from last time, we know that the housing production strategy is the way to plan for fair housing and racial equity. It's through the development of needed housing for members of protected classes who are experiencing housing inequities and have the least housing choice. So it brings those three things together. Next slide. And from last time, we also know that the housing production strategy is a rallying cry and also a community mobilization plan to deal with what's the housing that we really need but don't have yet in our communities. Next slide. And so in order to get the job done, we know that the housing production strategy should include things that probably go beyond land use actions to develop the kinds of housing that's needed, and also for the people that really need it. So both the what and the who are really important, along with the why, which is equity and racial equity in particular. Next slide. And that thus it's the whole city that needs to get involved and all of its partners bringing together all the different kinds of tools and leverage and bully pulpit stuff that it can possibly muster. Next slide. So last time we also talked about that through HUD and through our own understanding of what HUD is doing in its application to the Oregon land use system, we've come up with some analytical areas, the issue areas to look at to determine fair housing issues. And so we've come up with 5 of them plus a 6th one is any that cities might want to add on their own that they believe are important. We don't want to exclude that option. And we've talked about 3 of them, and we're going to talk about 2 new ones and one returning one today. Next slide. When we talk about how the impact of housing location, and I'm thinking, hopefully your wheels are turning and thinking, or have been turning, reading the materials, thinking about how location integrates with patterns of integration and segregation, very specifically issues of racial equity embedded in that, and how those patterns intersect with patterns of poverty and affluence. Not next slide. fair access to community assets, and we'll talk about that in a second, and then fair housing to housing for people with disabilities. Let's go on to the next slide. So as I already said, I got ahead of myself here. Segregation and integration often overlays, those patterns often overlays with patterns of poverty and affluence. And the ones that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, particularly are concerned about are the confluence of poverty and segregation, and how that can result in racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. But in Oregon, we're also concerned about the confluence of affluence and segregation, because it's it's the flip side. And so you need to work with, it's kind of like a spider doing push-ups on a mirror. You need to work with both sides in order to get something done. Next one. So you've already given us some ideas on this topic, and these just touch on a few of the things that are on the Miro board. All neighborhoods and all residential areas should have a mix of housing types. And this is a way of using housing types and locations to get at that idea of integration, how to promote more integrated economically, racially, and ethnically neighborhoods. Mixed income areas, which goes along with that, new and affordable, accessible housing in high opportunity areas. And also strategies for mitigating the higher costs of going there, if any. You talked about that pretty extensively. Deconcentrating areas of poverty, how important that is, and how it's really important to map that with strategies for preventing displacement. Next slide. The second area we're going to be talking about is access to community assets. And you might have noticed a little bit of a language shift, and it's intentional. And it actually comes out of a kind of a national discussion on this topic. And the idea is access to opportunity can be a very individual thing. What is opportunity for a school-aged child might be really different for an older adult with chronic kidney disease. I just picked that one out of the thin air. And you can well imagine opportunity. While there's overlap, there are also some important differences, and actually what might be most important to them might be a little different. But there is that overlap, and one of the most important, I'll say, overlapping factors that, using a fancy word from statistical things, co-varies with others is childhood poverty. Just tuck that away for a later time. That childhood poverty is often an indicator of a number of other things. So access to opportunity, the language is really more access to community assets. Next slide. Because assets are the things that people share in common mostly, realizing that there are individual differences. So access to community assets and avoidance to harms, the flip side of access to community assets, are what we're going to be the full area to be looking at. And HUD gave us some pretty good direction in its earlier versions of doing fair housing plans about what they considered to be, what it considered to be important community assets. I mentioned low poverty neighborhoods, not so much for the presence of low poverty, but just it maps on a lot of other things. Proficient schools, employment opportunities, transportation networks, and environmentally healthy areas. And looking at the wording in HB 2001, the enabling statute, and then also just sort of thinking a little bit about what's already in and goal 10 deals with. there are a few other areas that are really important, and all of these expand into a lot more things. So very specific things, but areas with communities serving commercial, recreational, institutional uses. That's the idea of like a 10-minute, 15-minute, 20, whatever the distance is, minute neighborhood. Fair distribution of public services like water, sewer, and things like that. Environmental justice. And then also here in Oregon, we need to think about the intersection with climate-friendly areas. Next slide. And you've mentioned a bunch of things in this area already at your prior meetings, and so it's important. We're saying back to you, we heard it, we get it. It's really important, and these things are. We agree with you. These things are important. So avoiding health risk areas, walkable, rollable, bikeable areas, service, resource, food deserts. Places that are location efficient, access to transit, and the importance of parks and open areas. Next slide. So the last topic area is Fair Housing Act and the location of housing for people with disabilities. And we have also touched on this you have touched on this in your discussions as well. So the Fair Housing Act speaks to a few things that are actually required. People with disabilities should have the choice of living and location integrated with housing for the general population. And the Fair Housing Act actually goes a little bit further in its interpretation than what Oregon statute currently has enshrined in it. And it talks more generally about group homes, not just a specific type of group home. For people with disabilities should be integrated with other residential housing, and it cannot be treated differently than single unit detached homes, cannot be zoned or regulated differently than a single unit detached home, and that group homes, and just one of the things that we all know is that the type that runs into the most opposition are often people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, addictions, and mental health challenges. We know that. I mean, you all know that from your time in the community. And also tying in with our idea about location, community assets are really important, especially when it's hard for you to get around. And so thinking about that in terms of both integrating housing for people with disabilities throughout the community, but also purpose-made housing for people with disabilities and its location. Next slide. So two other things to keep in mind. People with disabilities, there are two important, there's one Supreme Court case that is extremely important, and also the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA, which was adopted in 1990, had as part of it something called the integration mandate, which requires public entities to administer all these things in the most integrated setting appropriate. And that also, applies to where they're located. And so it has a land use dimension. And then Olmstead, in 1995, brought a case under the Americans with Disability Act to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court talked about unnecessary segregation and declared that it was a form of discrimination and had to be avoided. And they also offered this 3-point test for determining when a person with a disability must be served in the community. So when it's appropriate to the person's needs, when the person who is disabled doesn't oppose community-based services, and if the state or local government can reasonably modify its programs and services and where they're delivered to provide services in the community. Next slide. Is that it? Oh, okay. So just in conclusion here, as we said in the very beginning, we're headed toward a point where you'll be hopefully making some recommendations about choices about fair housing issue areas and integrating analytical processes for affirmatively furthering fair housing at your May 1st meeting. So today is setting that up, and then the conversation will continue. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alan to see if Commissioner Lazo, to see if he has anything to add.
Thank you, Dr. Tremblay. Really always appreciate the context for the work that we're doing and how important framing all those pieces are. One thing I would do is we loop back into our discussion about location. And I don't know that I need to remind folks of this, but I will, that we often talk about location and those elements of planning if I to use that same analogy I have in the past on occasion as sort of divorced from the history of it. And I'll just remind folks that location really is the physical manifestation of these past inequities, as well as the continuing plans and policies that we've put in place that have perpetuated those inequities. So, as we talk about location, we really can't separate it from sort of how we got here, how our communities have developed today. So I think it's really easy to talk about location as this thing, but it really is the ultimate manifestation of the work that has happened over time and the work that we're trying to undo moving forward. So as we move into discussion, that's the piece I think that really weighs heavily with me, and particularly as Mari introduced the racial equity framework this morning, the kinds of considerations that we have around location in every community in our state. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Really appreciate that, and a perfect tee up for the discussion today. That the legislation really gives us an opportunity to dig deep on what can be done to interrupt those systemic historical harms and patterns of segregation. So that's what we're going to be asking you to talk about with regard to locations today. So just let me set this up for you a little bit and tell you how I'm going to facilitate this morning, because you all have probably recognized that there's a lot of meaty questions on the table. So we are going to take the questions in order to confirm that. However, question number 2, as we started thinking about future meetings, we realized that question number 2 would probably be better integrated with probably May 1st, but one of our future meetings. So that one we're not going to address today, but we're going to start with 1, 3, 4, and 5 as we have time. So how I'm hoping to manage the time today is discuss question number 1 for 20 to 25 minutes. 3 and 4 are very related, so we're going to take those as a unit, but we can keep them distinct, but sort of talk about those for 20, 25 minutes. And then with the remaining time, we can get to question number 5, and or we can visit some of the prior questions if I end up cutting those conversations short. So bear with me. Let's see how this goes. We're trying to maximize our time together here while being mindful of the rulemaking schedule the legislature has set up. So it means we don't always have the time for a warm up. We're just jumping into the deep end. So for today's meeting, let's keep in mind the locational ideas that arose in meeting 2, and there's a link in your agenda to notes from that, but let's build on the work as we dig into the discussion questions. As Andre recapped, locational attributes you all mentioned for considerations under Goal 10 planning include considerations for all types of neighborhoods, all residential areas, high opportunity or high amenity areas, areas of poverty and deconcentrating poverty, mixed income, health risks, walkable, bikeable, transitable areas, if that's a word, and then service and resource deserts or food deserts. So we also heard in meeting 3 that many cities cannot perform the in-house geographic analysis that may be needed to understand and begin to expand on this housing choice for all Oregonians. So you'll see some questions in here about the type of data or assessment that's needed to drive toward this housing choice. And I'll have some other thoughts and prompts as we go. And then as Mari so well set up and Commissioner Lazo expanded on, let's just continue to center racial equity in the discussion and being intentional about bringing that forward with relationship to data justice, community empowerment and impact, and sort of considering those past harms that continue today, and how can we address those geographic patterns of integration and segregation with regard to protected classes, and how can we plan fair access. So with that, I'm going to manage facilitation similar to the last couple of meetings where our hope is to maximize, again, our time together, but also make sure that everyone has the space and comfortable place to have a discussion. So I'll invite you all to make sure you're listening as well as contributing. And I'm going to open it with the first question, which is addressing geographic patterns of integration and segregation with regard to protected classes. How can local jurisdictions promote mixed income and accessible neighborhoods, bringing in those concepts of housing choice and affirmatively furthering fair housing, and thinking about what jurisdictions can do? Consider the sort of what we've discussed, deconcentrating areas of affluence, deconcentrating areas of extreme poverty or poverty, and ensuring accessible availability for all. So who would like to kick off a discussion on question number 1? Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. Go right ahead.
When I think about this question, this is something that we as the housing authorities do a lot of, which is really understanding where our different income level housing are in our city. And so once we've identified a targeted area where we feel there's lacking maybe subsidized housing or maybe some more affordable housing, we start digging in a little bit more into those specific neighborhoods. So I think mapping is like our best tool to try to identify those areas, because without knowing, it's hard to see it. I think visually GIS mapping too is really beneficial. So I wonder if there's an opportunity for cities to maybe put that together with the help of the housing partners, and potentially provide funding for any local government that doesn't have the resource to do that, maybe through a state funding source of some kind.
Yeah, dig in and map so you can truly understand what those areas of segregation are is a great first step in trying to figure out how to support that. Nathan, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I think this plan has been made in other meetings, but probably the single biggest thing that jurisdictions could do to deconcentrate poverty and promote equity would be to eliminate single-family zoning and to reduce minimum lot size developments. I think if you see in many areas, especially suburban areas of different metro areas in the state, the zoning very, very clearly is meant to keep people of certain income levels out of the neighborhood and make it cost prohibitive, make developments impossible to serve middle and low income people. So single family zoning, get rid of it, reduce lot size. And then just in general with land use rules, our land use rules empower wealthy people to contest developments that they don't want, right? And the NIMBYism that many of us deal with is very much empowered by the way we have the land use rules system we have, right? Anyone can contest any development that they don't like. And if they have the money to hire a lawyer and the sort of social capital to put together an argument, they can delay and kill developments all the time, many of which, not all of which, but many of which would have the effect of deconcentrating, deconcentrating income, making more diverse neighborhoods, more diverse areas. The other thing I was thinking, which really is probably not at all the purview of this group, is I feel that a lot of, at least in Portland, and I think this is true in other cities, a lot of the conversation around wealthy neighborhoods ends up being focused on the public schools and how certain families want to get their kids into certain high-performing schools. And I think clearly outside the purview of this group, but I think having really high quality schools available to everyone everywhere would help reduce the pressure that I think a lot of families feel, especially wealthier families, sort of end up wanting to buy their way into a particular school. So if they can afford the neighborhood, they'll buy their way into that. So thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm hearing some practical ideas about how to loosen up standards or regulations around land use, also some process needs. And then thank you for acknowledging there's some things outside of this process, but definitely relate to this housing choice and ability for families to move into areas that are concentrated affluence. So with that, I'm going to move on to Julia.
So Nathan started to hit on some of the things I wanted to lean into. Kind of on the topic of NIMBYism, it's one of those complicated topics where it's kind of a soft pressure. It's a little hard to regulate against that, but I think that there are some examples that at least can and should be considered. So, of course, clear and objective standards are actually required, but ensuring that those are usable, are the path of least resistance to a development, not making it so that going through a process with layers and layers of reviews, and with every layer of review, there is another layer of opportunity for appealing that Nathan was talking about. And so ensuring that the way that the code is written is not just clear and objective, but in a way that makes it really easy for someone to be developing affordable housing and not appealable. There was something else I was going to bring up. Oh, and then also I think that there's, I've seen some interesting concepts in some of the HPSs that I've been reviewing related to kind of focusing or prioritizing incentives related to affordable housing in certain parts of cities in order to, if you kind of have to find a compromise in terms of, okay, we can't afford to yes, thank you, Marty. We can't necessarily afford as a city to, provide waivers or incentives across the entirety of the city. And if that is truly the case, prioritizing those in areas with these high opportunity access points, access to these schools, basically, again, kind of removing some of those barriers to providing affordable housing in these areas that have concentrated affluence.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for bringing that forward. I think I heard a similar sort of comment about, using incentives more strategically to bring equity at the last RAC meeting. So thank you for bringing that into this conversation as well. Tara, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Speaking a little bit from experience about Gresham doing its housing production strategy, which was adopted last year. I think the emphasis the emphasis from our consultants and the guidance that we received was really that we needed to focus on sort of housing production, zoning, and then also incentives. So these are the things that, I saw coming up in the past few comments, and I really appreciate those. I think they're incredibly important keys to the puzzle. However, as we did talk through and continue to talk through, the deconcentrating areas of affluence, as well as ensuring accessible housing in all of our neighborhoods, we kept bumping up against that there are certain concentrations of affluence in areas where there may be assets like a good elementary school or great parks, but there aren't other assets like frequent transit, or maybe they are a food desert. So part of the challenge is building assets, social assets, community assets, assets like transit where it's appropriate, in order to support location and housing choice. So, I'm interested in this conversation that, perhaps the strategies in the HPS need to be a little bit broader, or there needs to be greater consideration outside of, for example, just zoning regulations and funding. And perhaps there are things that we need to do as, communities to help build up assets in new locations to support choice and equity.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you for bringing up, right, communities are very complex and not all of them that are affluent and have some assets, have all the assets that make it a really rich and rich opportunity place. So thank you for that. Mary Kyle.
Thanks. I want to build on the comments that went before, especially Nathan's comments about removing detached single-family zoning. And I would add to that, actually allowing housing types that are more likely to include rentals in the rezoning of those areas, especially in those areas of assets. And I think we have to be very careful in how we discuss these to not relegate rental housing to a less desirable category that often rubs off on how people think about those who live in rental housing. And I think we have to remember that many people choose to live in rental housing for many different reasons at some points in their lives. Most of us have lived in rental housing, may still be living in rental housing for a variety of reasons. But there has been some work done by the Harvard Joint Center for Housing on rental deserts, which completely overlap with the detached high-income single-family housing, which, as Alan noted, reflects past patterns of economic and racial discrimination. Rental housing is often the entry point to a more stable housing situation and eventually home ownership. And in areas of assets makes a big difference on health and economic and educational outcomes for families. But there are ways to, I think that we should build into this, that like Julie was just talking about, how to ensure that there is affordable home ownership. If we're going to talk about home ownership, we really have to talk about affordable home ownership to those of moderate and lower incomes, including targeting where OHCS invests its funds and using surplus publicly owned lands, land banking, density bonuses for affordable housing, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Kyle. Appreciate that. Ideas for strategies, as well as pointing out some opportunities to interrupt those patterns of exclusion. Brock, please.
Yeah, two comments. One, I know this is not the rule, these are just discussion notes, but I want to be clear that we're not saying just eliminate single family zoning, but don't make it exclusive single family zoning, right? The other piece that I would say is just a big +1 to reducing opportunities for NIMBYism to disrupt the process through, appeals and public objection to things like affordable housing, things of that nature. So +1 there.
Thanks, Brock. And just want to acknowledge, I think we have a diversity of opinions here about whether it is limiting to allow single family detached or areas where maybe it would be disallowed, but that's fine. We can have a diversity of opinions. That's why we're here. Thank you. Kim, welcome.
Thank you. First, I wanted to just talk about in the context of rulemaking and affirmatively furthering fair housing. I see it as sort of a methodology of thinking. So asking the jurisdictions to go through the process of evaluation. So in the case of displacement, the plan should have an element of evaluation of who's most vulnerable to displacement and what are the plans that that community is going to put in place to prevent that displacement, so that you ensure that while you're bringing assets in, you're also retaining the economic and racial and ethnic diversity of the community. And then in regards to accessibility of housing, again, it's sort of a thought process where the community needs to ask itself, if we're going to build housing that's accessible for a particular population, it has to be accessible not just within the housing, but to those community assets. So how is that person going to get to shopping? How are they going to get to their doctor? So from the front door to the door of the asset, there needs to be consideration for that accessibility as well.
Thank you so much for bringing that in, right? It's not just about the site and the unit that's important, but the to the location. especially for accessibility and folks who don't have as many choices. And then I also appreciate you bringing in the sort of some ideas about how to get at this threat of displacement in areas where, you know, additional community assets would be beneficial. So thank you for that. Michael, hi.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Yeah, so Nathan and Julia kind of sparked a thought in my mind. I think it's a real challenge that probably occurs everywhere, but especially in rural communities, I think, is the NIMBYism is very powerful in our rural communities. And the appeal process, while I'm a little concerned if we talk about making it a little harder for somebody to file an appeal, because I'm finding that appeal process is very valuable to both sides. And I think a lot of the NIMBYs, at least in rural communities, and hopefully none of my decision makers are going to see the recording of this, but we have a lot of NIMBYs on our, you know, city council. That's, you know, you don't get to be on a city council unless you're an NIMBY. You know, it's really hard if you're of a, you know, a population that is a little more challenged. You have a hard time becoming a city councilor and a decision maker. And so I would like to see the appeal process clarified and maybe have higher standards. We focus very heavily on land use standards at the state level and passing those down to make sure our codes get changed to accommodate specific standards or accommodations. But we do not really talk about the appeal process. And you know, just in the comments that Nathan and Julia made, I pulled up my land use code and I'm looking at the review criteria for somebody to file an appeal. And all you have in our case, and I think it's probably the case in a lot of communities, all you have to do is identify the grounds for appeal. They don't have to be valid grounds. You just have to identify valid grounds that you're submitting based on. And it could just be my opinion is different. And suddenly I have a valid appeal that goes through the process, and I can hold somebody hostage for months and months and months on a project. And I'm just thinking of a project. We had a housing project that was proposed that, you know, it went to our city council on appeal, and it was because of the NIMBY thing is they actually got denied. And it wasn't the affluent people that, you know, were filing the appeal. You know, the folks that needed that housing were the appellant. And it was easy for them to file an appeal, but it was hard to get through the NIMBY side. So anyway, I would just like to see, you know, some conversation at some point on, if we're talking about land use rules, to try to clarify the appeal process and what makes a valid appeal so that you can't just appeal based on an opinion. It's got to have merit. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for chiming in and offering those or that sort of experience and, you know, sort of the need for a surgical approach to thinking about the appeals process. I just want to acknowledge we have quite a few hands up. I'm gonna take Garland, then Kathleen, and then I'm gonna go to a couple of folks we haven't heard from yet, Brianne and Shannon. And then I'll circle back to those of you also in the queue. So bear with me here. Thank you. Go ahead, Garland.
Sure thing. I've got 3 points. The first is to allow multifamily housing and single family zones with sufficient units. The cost per unit can be brought down to affordable levels. Yes, this essentially does mean eliminating single family zoning and the economic and racial segregation that it was intended to facilitate. We need to provide access to home ownership through fee simple homes and townhomes, condos, and full equity housing cooperatives. Second point is to lean into promoting conversion of existing apartment buildings into limited equity resident-owned housing cooperatives as the best way there is to prevent displacement. We need to consider regulating these using an average income level per building to allow them to gradually evolve into mixed income cooperatives. And the state needs to take a role in this in providing sufficient financing to enable these conversions to occur. Residents are at risk of displacement today, yet the state currently offers no programs to provide financing to residents seeking to purchase their apartment building for conversion into a resident-owned co-op. It's almost like the state of Oregon doesn't care if residents get displaced. The third point is we need to allow accessory commercial units in all zones. so that residents have pathways to entrepreneurship in all areas and thus more pathways out of poverty.
Thank you so much, and thanks for additional ideas about how to address displacement and then also how to pursue mixed income communities, as you all have mentioned, is important in locational situations. Kathleen, you are next, please.
2 quick points. I remind people that the single-family zoning under the new law includes middle housing, which means that we don't want to get rid of single-family zones because now there can be duplexes, quads, clusters. We just need to find a way to have those built on single-family zoned properties. The other thing is when you talk about accessibility, it's not just physical accessibility, it's mental and emotional accessibility. So that's, you need to talk about group homes and group facilities and figure out a way to get them cited and to tighten the standards under which they can be approved so that they are as of right in virtually all neighborhoods. And I believe under federal law, both group housing homes and group facilities are entitled as a matter of right to be in single-family zones, which means we need to cite them there and to support the nonprofits who are building and operating them.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the reminder of the full spectrum of abilities and disabilities that we need to consider when we're thinking about locations of new housing units. Okay, next is, give me a second, Brianne, thank you.
Thanks. Just kind of a quick point to make. It seems like we've mostly been talking about existing neighborhoods of affluence or access or concentrations of poverty. And I guess I just want to make sure that we're mindful too of expansion areas and new neighborhoods, and how does the work that we're doing and how will these rules apply to ensure that we're not continuing to build or expand greenfield development, and thinking specifically about, SB 1537 and a lot of, and even the work that we've done in the city with affordability requirements. It's a great way to get more affordable housing, but just being mindful that we're not creating these future concentration of a certain type of housing so that we can have kind of these more mixed neighborhoods. So just being mindful of that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Really, really important point for sure. And we're also talking about areas that are currently concentrated areas of poverty with, as you just mentioned, racial and ethnic communities in them. So next is Shannon. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate everything about this conversation. I know that mapping current concentrations of wealth and poverty using GIS has been mentioned. I think comparing that to historical mapping of redlining areas is something we've talked about elsewhere, and it sounds like we might talk about again, but I think that could be a really important step in this process. I think when we talk about the qualitative data, taking an assets-based approach to engaging all communities. So just, I think, words to live by is most people kind of know what they want and need. It's finding who that contact is, who is trusted for sharing that information, and really deeply listening, right? Deeply listening. That's going to be important, and it would be, I think, wonderful to have kind of like an available group of practitioners available to cities, or somehow some kind of leveling up of best practices in that area. I don't know if we can even invite an expert to interface with this TAC, who are, I can think of like Minerva Strategies. I know someone who does this so well, who's done some work on resident-based vouchers, for example. And then very concretely, getting back to the concrete, townhomes are just such a useful tool. I may sound like a broken record. They can become rentals, they can be owned. They are part of the middle housing that's allowed. So whatever cities can do to facilitate townhomes, because they also can more easily be profitable for for-profit developers. And I just wanted to highlight that for-profit building industry, have a lot of capacity too that we want to tap into for this shared vision for our state. And speaking of those for-profit builders, again, there's a nexus here with cities maybe incentivizing things that help a development to be profitable, to include more affordable housing that helps bring in maybe partners into that mix, whether it's a greenfield new area of a city or again, a profitable new development that may be serving affluent communities, just making sure there's a better mix of folks who get to live there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. And to the townhome, I remember, I think it was last meeting or 2 meetings ago, you all had a good discussion about that and how they're also potentially scalable in a different way than some of the larger multi-unit buildings can be. I see 3 hands up. I'm going to take them all, and then I'm going to move us on to the next set of questions. So Julia and Nathan Brock, go ahead, Julia.
So I just wanted to touch on the topic of displacement and gentrification real quick, and just kind of flag that there's a component of strategy related to order of strategies, meaning ensuring that housing production strategies are kind of contemplating what comes first, what is getting prioritized for funding, urgency, with implementing certain things ahead of other things, which can help minimize kind of those impacts of gentrification and displacement. So, when we're talking about bringing services and amenities into areas where maybe poverty already exists, I love that, and making sure that that is being coupled with anti-displacement measures ahead of those amenities coming in, which is going to be making those places more desirable. We have really great bad examples of that in Portland. I'm sure there's other examples in other cities as well. But just flagging that the order of implementation and prioritization really matters in that concept. And then back on NIMBYism real quick, just wanted to give a couple shout outs to some cool kind of different tools that I've been seeing implemented related to that, kind of on the education side of it. So a softer strategy, I guess. So Medford, I think, has published a really cool kind of 6-step toolkit for bringing affordable housing into neighborhoods that I love. It's kind of a compilation of different resources to both debunk certain myths like, will my property value go down when affordable housing gets built here, things like that, which can be used both by developers, the city, and for the public to kind of better understand the positive impacts of affordable housing. Excuse me. And then Grants Pass also has been recently launching some kind of marketing messaging newsletters specifically to developers to kind of help them navigate parts of their code that are meant to, again, kind of remove barriers to certain types of housing and help streamline those processes, which again, kind of, I think, minimizes some of the NIMBY impacts by helping developers know what parts of code they can leverage to use those by right aspects. So just wanted to flag those as solutions that I've seen that already exist.
Thank you so much, Julia, for bringing in those best practices from our colleagues in Southern Oregon. Nathan, please go ahead.
Yeah, there's so many things, so many topics. I'll just try to focus on one. I have like 6 notes here, but maybe just to touch on, again, the issue about land use process. I think everyone knows this, but just to underscore, like if you're trying to build multifamily housing or any kind of housing, the delays induced by the land use process and the uncertainty that I think Michael was describing, all of those things are very important factors for developers when thinking about building a certain area. And those delays and the uncertainty all builds in risk and cost. And so all of those kinds of factors, those sort of NIMBY factors, do tend to incentivize higher income developments, because to make the thing pencil, it's going to take you longer and has more uncertainty. It is going to cost more. And if you're a developer, you're going to therefore look at what can make your project pencil And when you factor all that kind of cost in, it's going to push you more towards looking at higher income housing at probably fewer units. So, so I guess just for me, the frame for this whole conversation is we have a housing crisis. Thousands of people are living and dying on our streets. And so the current system we have is not working, right? I think that's, to me, is the overall frame for this conversation. So I think we need to be willing to sacrifice what we thought of as sacred cows historically in our land use process in Oregon. And so, because I think it really is a crisis. There's a lot of other things I'll say, but hopefully I'll be able to navigate the mirror war later. Thanks.
Really appreciate that and bringing your experiences forward. Thank you, Nathan. Brock, last comment on this question, then we'll move along.
Yep. One big +1 to Nathan's comment about the timing and the process and being able to make more affordable projects pencil. Big +1 there. If I can give +2, great. The other piece, going to go back to single family housing again. Section 23, House Bill 2001, needed housing includes detached single family housing. It's not something that we can eliminate based on the statute that we're given. Just wanted to.
Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, so on a related note, but a little different perspective, we've talked about things local jurisdictions can do to increase access in areas of affluence. We've talked about methods and strategies and ways to increase the community assets and areas of concentrated poverty with supports to sort of ensure or attempt to ensure that displacement isn't happening. But let's talk for a minute about what sort of supports a local government or local jurisdictions may need to pursue this work in their housing planning and their housing production strategies. You all have mentioned in previous meetings that geographic and historical analysis is missing from the HPS program. I've heard you mention it also this morning. And you know, we're sort of wondering, can you offer some more specific details about what this analysis may entail for DLCD staff to understand better? And what is the balance between the work and rule versus guidance? We've heard some conversation about that as well. And which community assets and harms are relevant to analyzing the access to community assets and avoidance of harms. So really trying to dig in a bit more on what kind of data or assessments do local jurisdictions need to make this determination, and how does the data justice lens fit into that? So let's get going. Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, I'd be happy to kick us off with just an explanation of my experience with the displacement risk analysis from the housing production strategy. You know, we contracted Echo Northwest to basically pilot a methodology for displacement risk analysis. They pulled money from us as well as about 4 other cities in order to try and figure out how to develop potentially a best practice. So they did a displacement risk analysis for our city, which was used in our housing production strategy and also adapted into our comprehensive plan. That's certainly something that, you know, we couldn't replicate internally. Our understanding and what we were consulted was that there really was no best practice in terms of methodology currently. So what I'd offer is that there really does need to be an accepted methodology if you're expected to do a displacement risk analysis. And then we need people who are trained to do that, hopefully internally. So it's not something that we need to fund every time we go through our, you know, 6-year, 8-year cycle. You know, potentially having training for planners at the city level, I think would be great. But it should be a relatively easy and not so time-consuming task if it's something that we're going to be evaluating. And I do think it's critically important to evaluate it as part of our iterative process of looking at housing production, how we can get better and better at serving the needs of everyone in our communities.
Very helpful sort of feedback and experience on that, Tara. Really appreciate that. Alan, good morning.
Yeah, sorry for being late today. I was in a job interview until 10:30, and yeah, just had to get here a little bit late today. So I think that the biggest thing to push forward here is this lack of data that exists around accessible housing. And this happens partially because of policy, the ADA coming in around 1990, that not tracking of certain accessibility features that will happen in kind of permitting and really just the lack of data that exists. And so the big question is, without the ability to quantify the accessible housing stock, but knowing broadly speaking that we have a shortcoming of that type of housing, how do we create a proxy? And I've got ideas. This is not just a kind of random thing out there, but like, how do we create a proxy measure to understand where we are kind of in our community that could be used to create a production strategy to meet those needs? And I've talked about this in different presentations, including at not too long ago at the Housing Land Advocates Conference, is that the vast majority of our new households that are forming in the next 15 years will be people with an older adult in them. And if the vast majority of all of our new households are having an older person that are in there, then we need to think about creating environments that meet their needs as we continue to age as a population. But without knowledge of what our existing accessible housing stock is, we're basically playing a game of trying to shoot for a goal we don't understand. And so what can we do on that front end in the next kind of year to develop these proxy measures, to use less than perfect existing data from the American Housing Survey, to use less than perfect data that exists around when buildings were built as they pertain to Americans with Disabilities Act, when buildings were built under 504 compliance, to try and come up with an idea of what our existing versus that missing or that gap is. So I talked with Sean Edging recently about this, and I know there's some work that's happening around data collection and analysis, but that's just a big black box. And we're creating production strategies right now without understanding the current landscape. So I've got a couple of other thoughts that I'll put in writing, but just wanted to get that out.
Thank you so much, Alan. Really appreciate that. And yes, I know I've heard in prior conversations, if we're waiting for the perfect data, we're just going to be waiting for a really long time. So we probably do need to figure out some other systems. I want to highlight some of the questions in sort of embedded in questions 3 and 4 around access to commercial amenities, as well as parks and open space, which tends to be publicly owned, or most primarily is publicly owned, and how specifically mixed use housing can be planned or should be planned in areas that are poor in services and resources, resource or service apartheid areas. And then also bringing forward a comment that came from the RAC meeting last time, especially those housing developments that are receiving public funding, to require them to have mixed use really puts them in a jam with the cost. There's just the financing of those units increases, or the need for financing increases when you add commercial uses that can't be covered by that public funding. So want to make sure we get to those specific questions, and I see lots of hands up, so go ahead, Garland.
Sure thing. So I'm going to take these questions. I see 4 questions under question 3. I'm going to take them one by one.
Okay.
The first is, should specifically mixed-use housing be planned in existing service and resource apartheid areas? I think the answer is yes, this could be part of the solution, but it won't be a silver bullet. For question B, is the impact on market feasibility of going from a residential housing development to a mixed-use development worth it? The answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no, as you just mentioned. However, I'm not sure that the answer is let's just let low-income housing buildings off the hook for contributing to providing amenities in an area. I think that there's an alternative answer, which is let's provide financing solutions for that non-residential space that can work with that finance stack. That is, if you want to see non-residential space in a residential regulated affordable building, you should find a way to pay for it and not just make that housing provider try and find that budget out of their budget where it does not obviously exist. And then if not, how can local governments plan for service apartheid areas to become service rich? Again, accessory commercial units can be part of the solution, especially for primarily residential service and amenity deficient areas. And then I wanted to add another thing, which is, back to the original header of this question, planning for fair access to community assets, opportunity and exposure to harm for protected classes. I want to talk about noise. And there's 2 sides to the noise coin. First is the ability to live in a quiet residential area away from traffic noise, which is something that we often think about, but which is something that our current planning regime denies to people by forcing multifamily zoning into the zones adjacent to high noise highways. and then putting the single family areas as something that we need to protect, like they're these little eggs that might get cracked into the areas that are sheltered from those noisy highways by those apartment buildings, right? So that's obviously inequitable. We can see that once we say the words, but there's another side of that coin, which is the ability to recreate and to enjoy social events and nightlife involving loud music at late nights, which is important to many cultures, but it's something that planners rarely think about, but it's easily accomplished by allowing in industrial or warehouse zones and other areas that are not in or immediately adjacent to primary residential areas, nightlife uses that may be culturally appropriate for a variety of cultures.
Thank you. Just a real quick follow-up question, and not necessarily for you, Garland, it could be for anyone, but if thinking about noise, that could also be an issue of accessibility for people with disabilities that are really sensitive to noise for various reasons. But it would be good to hear what sort of data or analysis would be helpful for local jurisdictions to consider that as well. So I'll just toss that on the table. I'm going to go ahead and move on to Brock. Actually, Brock, give me just 1 second. I'm dealing not in my office today, so I can't necessarily see everyone. I can see hands up, but I know Kathleen often raises her hands. If you all can help me, if you see her raise her hand, can you just let me know that? I appreciate it. I know our folks are trying to help me with that as well. Great. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, and I'll just make 2 quick points. One, during the CFEC rulemaking, one of the things that was added in, I think a little bit later in the process, was removing the allowance for cities to require ground floor commercial for affordable units. I think that would be a good thing to replicate here because we have that in CFAs, but not necessarily everywhere else. And that's just due to cost of production and the ability for those units to be affordable once they're actually produced. The other thing that I want to touch on is mixed use buildings versus mixed use areas. Mixed use buildings, if you have commercial, ends up having ridiculously high, and I don't remember exactly what the numbers are, but relative to other commercial buildings, a ridiculously high failure rate. We're not doing anyone favors if we say, hey, instead of building a unit here, a housing unit, we're going to put a commercial unit there, and then it fails. So I would say focus more on mixed use areas, right? You might have a little commercial pocket within a neighborhood that has something like a grocery store, a dentist's office or things like that. But mixed use buildings is, I think, not necessarily the way to go. I think there's other ways to incorporate that are more economically viable. And then the other thing I was going to say is when if we're talking about adding like grocery stores into a neighborhood, make sure that what's going there is actually good. For example, I live in an area where there is a mixed use building with a market down below. The healthiest thing that I can find there is sometimes eggs. Everything else is booze, soda, chips, and cookies. But there is no healthy food there. So and there's no market for it because there's already an established Fred Meyer 1.5 miles down the road, right? And so consider what's around already to see whether something is going to be feasible. Mixed use areas, not buildings.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing your personal experiences as well as some ideas about how to address that. Julia.
So a lot of people have already mentioned this, but just to add another layer on the impacts of mixed use on affordable housing, definitely agree. I would say never require it. It's not just the fact that the funding doesn't pay for the commercial space, it's also that it increases the cost of building the housing as well because it kicks you into a different prevailing wage rate. If there's funding to backfill that, fantastic. It can happen, it should happen, but it should not be required to happen. I also just want to flag that even certain types of language, there's an example of this in Portland zoning code where there's an overlay that requires active uses. So it's not necessarily requiring commercial or mixed use, but active uses. And that resulted in an extremely long appeal process that essentially killed a affordable homeownership development along the Interstate Avenue corridor. So even kind of code language is a very slippery slope related to that. So I just want to make sure it's like very crystal clear the implications of that on affordable housing development. yeah, and I'll leave it there because I think everyone else has hit on the other notes I was going to give.
Appreciate that, Julia, that active uses isn't necessarily addressing the problem that is met with mixed use commercial as well. Kathleen, you are next. You have your hand up. I see a couple other hands up, but I also know there's a few people that haven't had a chance to speak today. So Kathleen, you go ahead, and then I'm going to just sort of check and make sure we're getting everyone's perspective. Thank you, Shannon. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I think in terms of data, when we're talking about commercial uses or other community assets, one of the things we need to know is what buildings are there that have in the past been commercial that are not occupied. I know as I drive around Portland, I see many locations that used to have businesses in neighborhoods that are empty. And rather than just create new spaces, I think we need an inventory of what the former commercial uses are because they're empty.
Good idea. So that could be an additional assessment or part of the analysis as jurisdictions are thinking about that. Thank you very much for that. And I saw a couple of thumbs up there. I just want to make some space for a few of the folks that haven't had a chance to speak today. I just want to make sure you all are feeling welcome in this conversation and have some time to contribute. Okay, we'll be speaking for another 5 to 10 minutes here. So please go ahead and raise your hand if you have some additional thoughts. Shannon, please go ahead.
I just wanted to call into this area of our conversation, public transportation. And also I would say times of day and frequency, right? So if you can get a bus when you need it to get to the grocery store and home safely, do you need a grocery store? You know, depending on distance, right? But maybe you don't need to be able to walk to the grocery store for some communities. Maybe you need better public transportation at appropriate times would be useful. Also for different kinds of careers. Some careers that are people who have lower incomes are working or are at different times of day. So I think obviously city planners know more about that than I do, but I wanted to flag that as tying in opportunities with communities. And then just because I think it's worthy of consideration, and I feel like it hasn't gotten much time in this space, childcare as an important residential and opportunity related use and purpose of buildings, and it can be in residential buildings and commercial mixed use buildings too, that we have an overall shortage of childcare. Often that is, those are businesses owned by women who are also lower income. So there's another opportunity there if we could think about incentivizing those businesses and creating tools at the city and municipal level to support those small business owners who provide much needed community services. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for expanding our thinking on types of community assets that are likely needed, and then also some assessment around public transportation and childcare that might be needed to support that. Brianne, please go ahead.
Thanks. Just kind of following up on what others have said is data that would be helpful, I think, and obviously it goes without saying, proximity to uses. Placing proximity to these uses is going to be key, but I think it goes beyond just proximity. Data that would be helpful would be like inventories of sidewalks, safe crossings, obstacles, because often proximity isn't helpful if there are major barriers like highways or train tracks or those types of things. I know that's something we do work closely with our parks on. And then other data that would be helpful really for commercial would be market studies on commercial viability. And more information on the density needed to support neighborhood commercial uses and proximity of density to neighborhood type of these types of neighborhood commercial uses, because I know that's something we struggle with. You can require something be zoned, but oftentimes it doesn't end up being built and it just sits vacant. And then state support for form-based codes. I think that could go a long ways towards shifting more flexibility in types of uses and just more allowance for kind of getting with the accessory commercial uses conversation, just more allowance for uses to naturally evolve and be what is more market feasible. So whether that's housing or commercial uses.
Great. Thank you, Brianne. Really appreciate that. Ariel Nelson, I'm going to go to you next. Hello.
Hi, thanks. I just want to take up your invitation. I've been quiet. I really appreciate all of this conversation. And I think all of these points are really important. Appreciate what Shannon just shared. I'm still coming from a place of like, what can we actually, what do cities actually have resources to do? What do all cities have resources to do? Childcare is a major talking point in our policy committee LLC right now. It's a major priority for cities, but if you're asking cities to incentivize childcare, if the city even has resources to provide funding to something versus housing versus, their core services. So just wanted to put that flag out there. I think what's been really helpful for me is when I'm hearing multiple people citing examples of what cities have already done in their housing production strategies, like in Medford or the cities that are on today. And I know this has come up, I can't remember if it was this TAC or a different one. And I think someone asked, hey, could we get like some bright points from some of the existing HPSs? And Sean said, I think it seemed like he was reluctant to like point to any one housing production strategy as like, this is what we should do. And I appreciate that and understandable, but I do think having some examples of how cities are doing this, and not to say that every city is going to be able to do that or it's going to make sense for every city, but I think looking at some concrete examples as they relate to these different questions and these different goals would be really helpful. And maybe looking at some different size cities or different location of cities around the state to get at, looking at some rural considerations, I think would be incredibly helpful to kind of put a little finer point on like all of these really important priorities and things to consider and like what that actually looks like in practice or could look like.
Thank you, Ariel. Yes, and as cities begin to really implement these HPSs, obviously we'll be learning more, but I think there's a real opportunity here to expand best practices beyond just these land use standards and regulations, sort of what the whole city can do to support housing. This is an area I know I've heard from cities and some of you just sort of, struggling and picking through how to expand that. So the more we can share best practices and successful ideas, the better. Thank you very much.
Thanks. If you don't mind, I forgot something else I wanted to say, which is that I fully understand and support that it's not just what's in land use code in terms of what we're talking about for housing production strategies. But again, a lot of cities, it's a transit district. They don't control where transit goes or is. But there's ways to work and coordinate and do those things. But just being like, maybe having kind of like it's kind of what the HPS is already, which is kind of like a toolkit and you kind of choose from it. And maybe it's putting like more, a finer point or like more direction in certain areas or more clearly identifying for these really great questions and goals and equity considerations, like what are the tools that fit within that a little bit more closely. But we've got to like maintain that flexibility for all of the different just realities in cities, resources, other districts, all those kinds of things.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you for that reminder as well. Appreciate that. Garland.
I'm noticing the time, and so I wanted to get some answers into both questions 4 and 5.
Great. Thank you.
So for question 4, what kinds of data and assessments do local governments need to make determinations about locational placement and fair access to parks, open spaces, and green spaces? I would say the answer is walkable network analysis to reveal if you can say walk your dog from your house to the nearest park or open space along a complete sidewalk network. And the state should provide this for cities and places that need it done for them because they lack local GIS capacity. And then for question 5, how do we manage planning for both current and future transportation networks, and what level of commitment for future transportation services can or should be implemented to plan for co-located housing? I'm going to skip the second part, but on the first part, the government needs to build out complete sidewalk, bicycle, and transit networks, especially in existing areas that currently lack them. It cannot wait for the private market to deliver infrastructure when new development occurs. We don't wait for farmers fronting freeway right-of-ways to redevelop their fields before the freeway gets built through that section. Why do we wait for residential lots to redevelop in order to get the sidewalk built past them? This is modal inequity and thus discriminates against low-income households who are less likely to afford to drive everywhere for everything. Cities can instead assess existing properties and place a lien on properties that cannot afford to pay the assessment that is due on sale or refinance in order to pay for this. And the state could also step in to provide financial assistance to pay for this needed infrastructure to level the accessibility playing field. This also means more trails and paths in rural areas to provide for non-auto mobility between rural places.
Thank you, Garland, and thank you for bringing up the public spaces, the transportation network, as well as parks and open space into the discussion here, and ideas about what cities and state governments can do to support that. And I'll just highlight as well Brianne's mention of sidewalk networks that are free of other barriers that make it difficult for all people to get around. So thank you. Other thoughts from anyone on questions? We'll put questions 4 and 5. Well, 5 we might pick up in a future meeting as well, but we'll put these in the Miro board for you all to add comments, just acknowledging we only have a few minutes here, but would really welcome to hear more about data or assessments for mixed use areas, parks, green space, transportation. Yeah, Nathan, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, people made this point. Just want to reiterate that requiring mixed use for affordable housing is a really bad idea for the reasons Julia said earlier. I think it would kill a lot of affordable housing developments if that were required. And then just a little bit of a random thought, but I think it's related to development. To the data question. My organization operates in areas in Washington County where often there is conversation around gentrification in certain neighborhoods, especially Southeast Hillsborough more recently. And I think cities, even a reasonably sized city like Hillsborough, could benefit from access to national research on gentrification. I think in the lingo that we talk about in the world we operate, we tend to think that gentrification automatically equals displacement. And I think that is sometimes true. Like, I don't think it's not true, but I don't think it's always true. And I think there are circumstances where what we think of as gentrification, where the neighborhood gets new housing, maybe nicer amenities, but the current residents or the previous residents also benefit and are able to stay. And I myself would be interested to know the research on why one happens versus the other. I think a lot of it does have to do with ownership of assets in communities, and we have assets that are owned by people with lower incomes or moderate incomes that tend to stay and then benefit from gentrification. But that might be interesting for cities that are trying to think through their neighborhood development strategies. Which scenario plays out under what circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. And that really sort of amplifies what was said earlier about the need to really understand who is vulnerable to displacement. If we married that up with some research, local or national research, it might become clear what strategies need to be in place for those investments. Alan De La Torre, please.
Hi there. I'm sorry, I'm waiting for transit right now, but I got 2 really quick thoughts. So there's a great body of work that's happening through the Center for Neighborhood Technology that's using a housing and transportation affordability index. So kind of combining how far people live with their housing affordability, something to look into because it helps to combine those 2 real large expenses that people have in households. And I will send along to staff some kind of preliminary work around age-friendly kind of environmental analysis that I did with a PSU student, kind of MERP MPH student that's looking at age-friendly social, physical, and service environments. It has data sources, but they're kind of additions to this complete communities, 15 to 20-minute neighborhood, climate-friendly, equitable communities, kind of thinking about aging and disability as the focus kind of data points. So that may or may not be immediate use, but I'll send that over nonetheless.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alan. Appreciate that. So I'm going to conclude our discussion for the day and move us into wrap up. And like last time, I'd like us to check back in on how well we collectively did or didn't do in addressing some of the questions posed around the racial equity framework and also the topic that we're tackling here. And I maybe open it up and offer Alan Lazo a moment to weigh in, if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. And I would certainly invite other folks too. But I'll just kick it off by saying first, let me give a specific example that ties back to the racial equity framework, and particularly the benefits and burdens piece, which wasn't one of the ones we highlighted today, but we know is one of the big overriding categories in lots of the places that we are exploring. And particularly, as we talked about today, in the inequities that exist in the appeals process. And so that is one where benefits and burdens can be clearly outlined in that one. So I think that's one that as we talk about that area that we focus on. And the other one is I'm prone to do, I'll fly up and make some big connections around a couple of the places that we talked about today when we talk about kind of the interplay of data and then policy and then community engagement, right? When we think about the mapping that might be needed to understand racial segregation in a community, and then the kind of community engagement, or I might want to use the word community informed work that we might do, since constantly engaging community may not be the best way for us to do that. But we know what community looks like in our communities. We often know what already needs to be done. We don't necessarily need to engage folks to do that. But so our policy work that comes from the mapping that might be done needs to be community informed, whether or not that's through engagement or other pieces, but really needs to be informed, as I think Kim said, that communities know what they want and what they need, particularly around issues like displacement. So then that kind of goes back and forth to the policy piece and the mapping and the engagement. And then I think I'll give a concrete example. I actually had the opportunity to speak on Fair Housing Day out in Washington County earlier this week, and I missed the opportunity because I went over time to use this example that I sometimes have used. If you look at a map of racial segregation in Washington County, there's a very bright red spot in the Bethany area for the Asian community. And one of the things I say is, if you know much about that community, my understanding of it, I actually know some folks that live in that community. It's a really concentrated area of South Asian community members who a lot of them work at Intel. And from a fair housing perspective, one of the things I say is, I'm not sure our goal is to take all of Washington County and make it all maybe a brown color that is entirely mixed up, right? We have to understand that some communities are making choices about where they live based on lots of different factors, whether they're cultural, they might be safety. So I'm not sure our goal is to deny that opportunity. Our goal is true choice. What would true choice look like? It might look like that map, right? And so we really need to understand what's happening in community and fly up from the data or down from the data to understand what community-informed decision-making and policy-making might look like. So to me, it's always been a really interesting example. I guess is also, if you looked at a map of affluence, it might be a very affluent area. And so I'm not sure, again, that our goal would be to break that up. I don't know. I'm not policymaking. I'm just saying it's an example of how we might need to examine what's happening there in all of our data.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you for pulling in the racial equity framework questions sort of all together. We are at time. So I'm going to close it there. I so appreciate the open discussion you all had today and the really thoughtful pathways that are possible under Goal 10 and the housing planning rule. And we will not meet next week, but we will meet on May 1st. And I have that right, correct? Alan just gave, okay, thank you. Alan scared me. We will meet on May 1st and we'll share the Miro board for follow-up. Oh, Madi, you had one point you wanted to make about the Miro board. Yes.
If I may, really quickly, folks, we got upgraded to a better software or a better level of Miro board. That might require new access. It might not, but just stay tuned. Like We will make the mural board accessible for additional comments beyond today. But just a heads up that maybe you might get a new invitation. But I'll be in communication with you all.
So keep your ears to the ground, your eyes on your email for that. And with that, we'll conclude, and I will see you all in a couple of weeks. Thank you again.
Quick question before you break.
Yes.
The May 15th meeting, is there any chance we could shift that to the following week?
Let me thank you for asking the question, Garland. We're going to have to confer, and then we'll let you know.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day. Good to see everyone.
Thank you all.